Good morning and welcome to Tuesday Bible Study, second hour. Obviously, I am with you in spirit, but also via video, I guess, and grateful for technology and for its ability to help us to continue teaching. So many of us actually have the opportunity to follow along actually through our SCC Institute. And so some of you are watching me on video. Get it, Steve? Steve's actually still here in the room. So, anyway, what I want to do in light of our lesson from Isaiah 52, 53, 55 is look particularly at Isaiah 53 and think about what this text, not just who it prophesies in terms of does it actually point specifically to Jesus Christ, but it does more than that. It does more than just say, hey, by the way, the one that you're looking for, his name is Jesus. Notice that the text does not bring the kind of clarity that most of us really want, i.e., what is the name of the one who died on the cross for our sins? The Bible doesn't just give us names, and then somehow that name itself is the fulfillment of that prophecy, but it's bigger than that. It's not just that name, but it's that person. And it's not just that person, it's like who that person ultimately is. And so it is the person of Jesus Christ, who is a very specific anointed one, appointed one of God to accomplish his purpose. So the identity of Jesus in terms of who he is going to matter. And so the Isaiah promise is not just speaking vaguely because he doesn't know, because ultimately the author of Isaiah is God. Obviously, he knows, and what he's far more interested in than just giving you the name. His name will be Jesus. His mom's name is Mary. His dad's name, according to human understandings, would actually be Joseph. And no. Like Matthew can write that down the road. But right now, what Isaiah is revealing to the people of Israel is God's servant, who he is, in the sense of like what he is like and what he accomplishes. So what the scriptures are describing over and over and over again, and this is actually the joy for us to celebrate on Tuesday morning, is not just who is God, his name is Yahweh, but who is God, and we become enthralled at the depths of his grace, or the magnitude of his holiness, or the breadth of his understanding, or the almost endless patience that he seems to demonstrate. So our fascination with God is more than just his name, but it really becomes like his character, who he is. And so the prophecies that we actually are seeing in the book of Isaiah and what they are pointing to, when it's describing God's faithfulness, that's a characteristic of him. When it's describing God's merciful graciousness, comfort my people, it's describing a quality of him. And here you have in Isaiah 53, and we'll kind of back up to Isaiah 52. If you kind of take a look at verse 13, it says this, "Behold, my servant shall act wisely. He shall be high and lifted up, and he shall be exalted." And when we think of God's servant, we usually go, well, oh yeah, like if you're God's servant, then of course you're going to be highly exalted, because God is great and highly exalted. So those kind of attributes, we just go check. They just seem to be kind of this one-to-one correlation. God is great. God's servant is going to be great. I'm in. I'm all for that. And then it continues. "As many were astonished at you, his appearance was so marred." Okay, whoa, wait a second here. Highly exalted, and then the next verse says, "so marred beyond human semblance, and his form beyond that of the children of mankind. So shall he sprinkle many nations. Kings shall shut their mouths because of him. For that which has not been told them, they see, and that which they have not heard, they understand." Now notice how that kind of fits in last week, the seeing but not seeing and the hearing but not understanding. Something is going to happen in terms of this servant that we are all of a sudden going to see clearly who God's servant is. And as you see this unfold, what's interesting is that Isaiah is giving us a picture of God's servant in such a way that the people of Israel who are going to be reading this text are going to be, in some sense, oh yeah, I know that. And in some sense, yeah, I don't see that. I don't know exactly how those things are going to fit together. So what I find interesting as we look at the character of God, the character and the nature of God, there are those aspects which make the most clear sense to us. So if we talk about God and His attributes, His love, or even His holiness, when we think about God in terms of just how strong He is, He's omnipotent, when we look at certain attributes of who He is, sure, that just makes sense. But then we have other ones that surprise us. And the one that this text is going to hit us on is that one, the servant. So it's easy for us to look at this text and describe it in the possessive, God's servant. But what we're actually going to see as Isaiah folds into the gospel narrative where there is the fulfillment of the Isaiah promise, is that to fully understand God's servant, the one who has been appointed by God, who is going to accomplish His purpose, when you just kind of stop and get a kind of a deeper sense of how big this story is, what you actually find out is that you see, in fact, God the servant. And that one doesn't usually fit in our category of things. If I were to ask you what God is like, I don't know if very many of us would go, hey, you know what God is like? God is like a servant. No. He's not like a servant. He's like a king. And the answer is yes. But what kind of king is He? And He is a kind of king that serves. Like just stop and think about that for a moment. That as much as we want to recognize the lordship of Jesus Christ, which I don't know how you argue it, right? He is King of kings and Lord of lords. And yet when you begin to unpack like what that means, this, I think in many ways, creates the confusion that exists both in the biblical world as well as in our own present day. So in the biblical world, the people reading Isaiah 53 for the first time or even hundreds of years later are trying to figure out who God's servant could possibly be. Not even fully understanding that when God is describing the great servant who is going to accomplish His purpose, ultimately the one who's going to do that, cat out of the bag, His name is Jesus. And He's actually not just He's not another prophet. He is in fact God. So God's servant is in fact His Son that He sent to accomplish His purpose. And His Son, who is one with Him, then joyfully serves the mission of the glory of the Father and therefore sacrifices Himself. We'll get to Philippians 2, but He sacrifices Himself for God's glory by becoming a servant. And it's that kind of like upside down world that causes great confusion and frustration for the children of Israel. And I want to even kind of go back and take a look. This confuses the disciples. We could go to a number of different Gospels to look at this. Mark 10 is probably one of the best ones to look at. So I want you to turn there right now to Mark chapter 10. And I like how this whole section develops because it really does. It kind of weaves itself together. And so when you look at Mark chapter 10, Jesus has already once before described what was coming down the road. In Mark chapter 8, Jesus makes it clear that His life is going to be poured out, and it is going to cost Him His life, that He is in fact going to die. And when He prophesies about His death, Peter, His disciple, objects to it. And the one thing that they could not fathom is that the Messiah, who is God's servant, what could never happen to the Messiah is death. Those things do not fit together. Pick one, pick the other, you can't have them both. And Jesus actually says, no, in order for you to understand this, you're going to have to understand this. And these two things coincide one with another. And we're going to see kind of how that not only creates some tension, because what does Peter say? Peter says, may it never be. Like, man alive, this doesn't actually fit together. So Peter objects to this, but he's not the only one that objects to this. Peter objects to this. The nation of Israel, you could even argue to this day, the nation of Israel objects to the idea or the possibility that the Messiah could even be rejected. Why would God send His Messiah? Because in a very kind of a real way, how does the death of the Messiah come about? It comes about through His rejection by the nation of Israel. And so what you actually see is Peter not understanding how these things are going to fit together. And I think Jesus has kindly, my dad would often say to me, like, you don't have to understand it. You don't have to get it. Last week we talked about that. Do you see it this way? And what the book of Isaiah says, what the Jesus' parables or even his teachings is, he invites us to for those who have ears to hear, let him hear. And we just hope that we can actually hear and see it. But let's kind of just back up a little bit, and so go over to Mark 10. So this is the second time that we actually see Jesus describing his impending death. But before we get that, which begins in verse 32, back up a little bit. Peter and the rest of the apostles and us are so influenced by the way that the world is, what we might want to call the right side up nature of the world, is that we know what important people look like and we know what not important people look like. We know where important people park and we know where not important people park. We know what important people do on vacation and what not important people do on vacation. Like, we just have this clear distinction of kings and servants. And what Jesus does in verse 13 of Mark 10 is he says, you don't get it. They were bringing little children to him that he might touch them, and the disciples, who have a right side up look at the world, which they think is the right way, by the way, and they rebuke Jesus for letting little children come to him. But when Jesus saw it, he became indignant with them. And he said to them, let the children come to me. And by the way, he's not saying this just because, Jesus just knows how to be cute. No, God isn't just trying to be cute. I mean, this is his nature. God's nature and character is at its very essence to care for those who really are of the understanding that they don't really have much to offer to God, and so they see everything as gift. Like, God is so warmly inclined to them. God loves that they get who he is and who they are, that they haven't quite grown out of their awareness of their need for someone to care for them. And Jesus becomes indignant and says to them, let the little children come to me. Do not hinder them, for to such belong the kingdom of God. For truly I say to you that whoever does not receive the kingdom of God like a little child will not enter it. And he took them in his arms and he blessed them, laying his hands on them. So Jesus essentially says, there is something about receiving the kingdom that means you have to have eyes to see or ears to hear, and the eyes and the ears that are necessary are ones that are able to kind of see the true nature of the kingdom. And I'm going to kind of hold on to something. To understand the true nature of the kingdom only develops when we have a true understanding of the king. because the kingdom, the reign of the king, is based upon his character and his nature. And so if we have a wicked, terrible, manipulative, exploitive king, then that's what his kingdom is going to look like. But if we have a loving, very, very generous, very kind, very forgiving, very serving king, then that's what his kingdom is going to look like. And so all Jesus is saying to Peter is the way that you see me as your king is the way that you're going to understand the nature of my kingdom. And then he says a very painful thing. You don't see it right. Like, you don't get it right. You still seem to have kids at the back, grown-ups at the front. You seem to have a rich at the front, poor at the back. You seem to have those that are like with us, those that are on the same page as us. Like we get the front, and then those people, those that are not us, they're at the back. And Jesus seems to have some problems with the way that Peter and the other disciples are looking at the world. And his argument is that, this is what's fascinating, is that you don't get me. Notice how if we go back to Mark 8, Jesus actually says this, developing this whole conversation. What does it begin with? This question. Who do people say that I am? You're one of the prophets. That's who they say that you are. Okay? But who do you say that I am? I believe that you are the Messiah, the Christ, the Son of the living God. Blessed are you, Simon. For human eyes and human ears did not reveal this to you, but my Father revealed this to you. And so you see it. And then he describes his death. So Peter gets it right, then Peter gets it wrong. And what Jesus is pointing out is that, Peter, like, you're getting it right. Like, you know who I am. You know my name, right? You know my name. My name is Messiah. But you don't know my nature yet. Like, you don't know my character. I really don't have time. I kind of wish Mac could have been here to maybe even to teach you this lesson, but he's on retreat. That's where we are right now, is we're on retreat in Joplin, Missouri. And if you want to kind of see an extended idea of how this Isaiah 53 has been developed as a messianic prophecy, and particularly how it's fulfilled in Mark 10, or at least described as fulfilled in Mark 10 in the words of Christ, is coming together of these two ideas of what's going on in Isaiah 53, where you have this servant, God's servant, who's going to eventually die, and what another major text that describes this from Daniel chapter 7. And in Daniel chapter 7, you see this amazing picture or this portrait of the Son of Man. And so that's kind of the idea. And boy, oh boy, if there was a part that the nation of Israel that they could kind of hang on to, was this Son of Man kind of figure. So Son of Man, contrary to what a lot of people believe, which is God, or Jesus is whenever he tries to stress his humanity, he calls himself Son of Man. If he wants to celebrate his divinity, he calls himself Son of God. Really not the way it's described in the Bible. But what we actually have is Son of Man. When Jesus describes himself that way, he says, oh yeah, I'm kind of attributing to myself, I'm claiming for myself the Daniel 7 figure, I'm him. And this is what gets people really, really upset. What no one was able to see without Jesus drawing deep connections is that the great God of Daniel 7 and the great God of Isaiah 53 are actually the same one. That the Son of Man actually is God's servant, is in fact God himself. That it's not just God's servant, someone who is subservient to God, but it actually, when you really see kind of how it's played out, right? It's God who is doing the saving. It is God is the one who's doing the serving in Jesus. And I want to be careful to be specific about that. But in Jesus, it's God who is the one who is doing the redeeming, who is doing the dying, who is facing the rejection. And that's what's causing the tension. That, man, this side of it I love. This side of it I'm in. But when you start talking about this side of it, I'm out. And what Jesus is saying, And what Isaiah is predicting, what Daniel and Isaiah are doing almost on, in some sense, even time-wise, on two different tracks, is they are taking a look at what God ultimately is going to do, and they see God reigning in power and in majesty over the nations. And Isaiah says, by serving and by being forsaken and by redeeming, by taking upon himself the sins of the world. And what we have in Christ is, if you want to think of it this way, all of these amazing texts from the Old Testament. That's why I've loved our Messianic Prophecies class on Monday nights. All of these texts of the Old Testament colliding together in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John in the person of Jesus Christ, the second part of the Trinity, the Son of God. And so you see in that first section in Mark 10, children being lifted up and Peter not being impressed. Then you see right on the heels of that, a rich man trying to get into heaven. And boy, I get it that kids don't, I mean, we really needed that lesson, that somehow kids should be near the front of the line, because that doesn't make any sense. And now all of a sudden we find a rich man being sent to the back of the line. I want you to sell everything you have and give it. So he says, kids, we need to have almost like this childlike, not childish, childlike awareness of our need to be blessed and cared for, and actually to be rich, to be smart, to have it together. Like those qualities usually become a barrier to God. And I want you to think about that. I've had so many conversations lately, and they come down to this, is people evaluating their understanding of who God is, and they like or they don't like an idea that appears to be in the Bible. And what I find fascinating is how easy it is for them to somehow claim for themselves the judgment seat. I mean, right now in our church, we've been going through these texts in the book of Acts where it describes the exclusive nature of Jesus in salvation. And I hear people say all the time, yeah, well, I'll tell you, if that's the way God is, then I don't want any part of him. Okay? Like, honestly, you really have, under God's sovereign grace, you have the freedom to reject it. I just want you to will you just admit to me that what you are claiming is that you know better or you know more than the way that God is described in the Bible? Can you just tell me that, like out loud? That in the end you seem to know better than God? If God is that way, then I don't want any part of him. If that's who he is, then you know what? I'm out. Wow. That when you think about that statement, it is unbelievably presumptuous. And yet that's what many people say. I will follow God if this is who he is. I will follow Jesus if this is what I can have. I will be a part of this kingdom as long as, I don't think you get how kingdoms work. That's not how kingdoms work. When kingdoms work, kings come and they establish the rule. And it is, I guess, maybe the Revolutionary War has just been so far removed from us that we literally believe like everything is democracy. And maybe it would be good for us, just for a moment, to just stop and to accept the fact that to be a servant in the kingdom is to acknowledge and to recognize he is the king and he can do whatever he wants. He's the one that sets the terms. And that's what Jesus is trying to get through to these disciples when the children come and when the rich man comes. And so then he hits it. So take a look at our text at verse 32. And here's how he says it. And they were on the road going up to Jerusalem, which when you're kind of in Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John, going up to Jerusalem, especially this late in his ministry, you know it's not going to end well. He says, Jesus is walking ahead of them, and they were amazed, and those who followed were afraid, so there's aware that something is going on. And taking the 12 again, he began to tell them what was to happen to him, saying, see, we are going up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man, and that's where that idea is now coming in. The Son of Man, and that's him. That's Jesus. That's the Son of Man. This is, I don't know if this is where your mind goes, but I guarantee you it is where Peter and the others, where their mind went. So I'm going up, and by the way, the Son of Man will be delivered over to the chief priests and to the scribes, and they will condemn him to death and deliver him over to the Gentiles, and they will mock him and spit on him and flog him and kill him, and after 3 days he will rise. And for Peter and the rest, for the nation of Israel and the rest, it's almost like if we can kill him, then he must not be the Messiah. And I want you to think about this. Think how dangerous it is. Their assumption is that if we can kill him, he's not the Messiah. And the reality is, if he doesn't die for his people, he's not the Messiah. Do you realize they have just put themselves in a losing position? Because the one thing they believe would disprove him is the same thing that proves him. And that's what's at stake. That's what's at stake for the 12, and that's what's at stake for the Pharisees and for the scribes. That's what's at stake for the nation of Israel. That's what's at stake for our Jewish friends today. When you've heard me say this before, when I talk to our Jewish friends, why do you have such a hard time believing in Jesus? And their answer is, because he was rejected by Israel. He was scorned and he died on a cross. That's not what happens to Messiahs. And I want to say, well, according to 53, it might be. According to Psalm 22, it actually not just might be, it is. Is that what happens to God's servant, because he is God the servant, is in fact those things. And so Jesus continues on, and this is what I find interesting. Notice how you have children and then rich man, and then Jesus tells the reality of him, that he's going to die. And then almost like a rich man type story, you see it develop in verse 35. James and John, the sons of Zebedee, come up to him and they say to him, "Teacher, we want you to do for us whatever we ask of you." By the way, that's not how kings and kingdoms work. We want you to do whatever it is that we ask of you. And he said to them, "What do you want me to do for you?" And they said to him, "Grant us to sit, one at your right hand and the other at your left, in your glory." Like Jesus, we heard this Son of Man speech, and we want in on that. And Jesus is going, I think you heard the Son of Man speech, but I didn't think you heard the God the servant speech. And this isn't a pick and choose. It's not a buffet. And you choose those that you do want, and then you get to reject those that you do not want. And so he actually says to them, "You do not know what you're asking. Are you able to drink the cup that I drink of, or to be baptized with the baptism in which I'm baptized?" They said to him, "We are able." And Jesus said to them, "The cup that I drink, you will drink. And with the baptism which I am baptized, you will be baptized." But which basically is that both James and John are going to go through that same tension and rejection that Jesus himself is going to go through. So he's prophesying that they will endure that. "But to sit at my right hand and at my left is not mine to grant, but it is for those whom it has been prepared." And when the 10 heard it, they become indignant at James and John, because that's what we do when we find out other people asked what we wanted before we could ask for it. I mean, they're all power hungry. They all want to sit at the head of the table. They all want the best parking seat. They all want the title at the end of their name. They all want to be recognized as the one who is great. They just don't want to be recognized in the way that God recognizes greatness. When the 10 heard it, they became indignant at James and John, and then Jesus called them to him and said to them, "You know that those who are considered rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their great ones exercise authority over them, but it shall not be so among you." See, this is what's interesting. What you guys are doing is exactly how the world works. You always fight and claw, and you always scratch and manipulate and exploit and take advantage of others so that you could find yourself in the best situation. That's what humans do. But not in my kingdom, Jesus is pointing out. But it shall not be so among you, but whoever would be great among you must be your servant, and whoever would be first among you must be slave of all. Why? For even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. And what you actually have in Mark chapter 10 is that the Son of Man is going to give his life as a ransom. And Jesus is describing to the disciples this reality about, first and foremost, the reality that Jesus is trying to point out to them is that this is in fact God's nature. First of all, so I want you to think about this. God's nature is one of a servant. Now, by the way, what's interesting is that many servants are servants because they have no ability to get outside of their predicament. The reason why you're a servant is because you really didn't get the education that was necessary for you to get a better job, and so you find yourself just bussing tables. And that's because you didn't work hard enough, or you don't have the gift set, or you weren't lucky enough to be born into such and such a family, or such and such a time, or such and such circumstances. But in the end, if you could have it any other way, you would change this. This isn't something that you want. And so for many of us, being a servant is something that is put upon us that we don't really like. I want you to think about that. That's the primary way in which it happens. But who can make God be a servant? Who could put him in a corner? Who could even, one of the things that I could do to my mom is that if I just kind of demonstrated just how needy I was and I'm sick, Mom, all of a sudden she would like spring into this action and she would be this servant. And I think she knew what I was doing, but it's amazing how I could get her to act a certain way towards me if I just kind of played up my weakness or my needs. Like, that's not true with God. God doesn't look at us and see how pathetic we are and then go, fine, I'll rescue you. No. While we were enemies, he came and died for us. While we were sinners, he died for us. While we were, Paul says, while we were dead in our sins, God's amazing mercy came and rescued us. See, the nature of God is one of servant. And I need you to think about that, because it's not, when we think about a servant as being like a weakness or something that is fundamentally flawed or broken, God actually says like that is a broken way of looking at the world and even looking at me. Like, what makes you think that value and worth and importance makes you sit in a place where you don't care for others? What makes you think like that is what is best? This is, many of us, our view of retirement is for us to be able to be somewhere where people serve us. Our view of heaven is for us to go somewhere where we don't have to work and literally others are just going to take care of us. Like, this is our view of paradise or some kind of an ultimate state. And God says, like, that's broken. Like, I'm a servant. See, so many of us try to fight for the parking spot or for the recognition or for the title of teacher because we're not really comfortable with who we are. And so I need you to affirm me. I guess I'm not content with who God says I am and who God made me to be, and I need to try to be something else. God is never that way. God has no interest or desire or compulsion within himself to prove himself to anyone. God is who he is. And in essence, like, God has the freedom. It's interesting. The word for helper that describes Eve in the New Testament, and I will make a helper, is actually the same word. We look at that and just go, oh, can you believe that God made women and to be helpers of men? I can. It's a similar word that God uses to describe himself in relation to humanity, that God is our helper. So maybe in the battle of the sexes that exists between men and women who are so mad and frustrated that they're not getting the recognition that they deserve, and I don't get to, and you get to, and I want to too, and it's not fair, and that's not... Like maybe that whole system is fundamentally broken. And men who exploit and take advantage of women have it wrong. And women who then try to reverse the tables or who aren't happy with their position decide, I don't like this. It's very interesting. Like God looks at all of that as broken, and he seems, amazingly enough, are you ready for this? God is absolutely like at peace with who he is, and therefore he is free to love and to serve and to forgive and to care for. That's an interesting thought. That the reason why Jim doesn't want to serve is because he doesn't like who he is. And I'm trying to be more important than I really am. God, on the other hand, is perfectly comfortable with who he is. And when he looks, I have to use language to try to explain. When God looks inside at himself, he actually sees a servant, and he acts like a servant. So here's what Jesus says. If God's nature is one of servant, and Jesus is in fact God, then he says this, then the children of God, or the servants, so I'm using that as a you and us, the servants of God, or the servant of God, is going to have the same nature as him. And that's why Jesus actually says, hey, I want you to be aware that the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, to give his life as a ransom for many. And therefore, if this is God's nature, and therefore it is God's servant's nature, then the followers of the servant of God So can I ask you a question? Think about this. If God's nature is one of servant, and the servant of God, who is in fact God, if his nature is to be a servant, then what do you think your nature should be? How could you ever sit there and argue for seats of power? How could you ever sit there and think that somehow you deserve something greater than the king, greater than your leader? So when you look at this and how it's described, by oppression and judgment he was taken away, and for his generation, who considered that he was cut off from the land of the living, stricken for the transgression of my people? They have made his grave with the wicked and with the rich man in his death, although he has done no violence and there was no deceit in his mouth. Yet it was the will of Yahweh to crush him. He has put him to grief when his soul makes an offering for guilt. He shall see his offspring. He shall prolong his days. The will of the Lord shall prosper his hand. Out of the anguish of his soul he shall see and be satisfied. By his knowledge shall the righteous one, my servant, make many to be accounted righteous, and he shall bear their iniquities. See, there is this ebb and flow, this back and forth between the Son of Man greatness of God, and without diminishing that greatness, he comes as a servant of God's plan and God's purpose for God's glory. That's what's happening in Isaiah 53. Well, I said that we would end here, and I think it's just kind of a very fitting text that brings these things together. So you don't need to turn here, but you probably know where I'm going to go. This is why the Apostle Paul, when speaking to the church in Philippi, tries to help them understand that only when you know the true nature of Jesus, and that being he is in fact God, and the true nature of Jesus, that fact that he is also God's servant, and in his nature a servant. Do you really get like how that then changes and fundamentally transforms how we love and care for and serve one another? And so Paul says, speaking about Jesus, do nothing out of self. Well, that's actually this part to the church, verse 3. Do nothing. Philippians 2, verse 3. Do nothing from selfish ambition or conceit, but in humility count others more significant than yourselves. Let each of you look not only to your own interests, but also to the interests of others. Have this mind among yourselves, which is yours in Christ. The mind of Christ is the mind of God. Paul says this in 1 Corinthians. The mind of Christ is the mind of God, and it is the same mind that has been given to us. So in essence, like you know that you get Jesus, and you know that you have Jesus when you have this kind of mind. And it goes like this. Though he was in the form of God, did not count equality with God as a thing to be grasped, but emptied himself by taking the form of a servant, being born in the likeness of men, and being found in human form, he humbled himself and became obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. Therefore, God has highly exalted him, and bestowed upon him the name above every name, so that at the name of Jesus every knee will bow on heaven and earth and under the earth, and every tongue confess that Jesus Christ, Jesus the Messiah, is Lord, the Son of Man, to the glory of God the Father. And so often when I read that text, it's almost like, yeah, for a little while, Jesus totally gave up everything God-like and decided to act totally opposite to God. I don't think that's what Paul's saying. I think what Jesus is doing is showing us. I mean, is it not? Is Jesus not the exact embodiment of God in flesh? Is Jesus in his being, in his nature, in his purpose, in his way of life? He's not less. I mean, that's one major theological doctrine, is that he's not less of a God. He's not a lesser God. He is in fact fully God. So even though he gave up, a lot and took on human form, I would argue that the one thing that never really changed is his service and being a servant to God's plan, to God's purpose, which is what? That he would make the world, that the world would rebel against him, but that he would come himself in human form and redeem it and restore it by the presence of his Spirit. That's how God works. God the Father, God the Son, and God the Spirit. I hope this has been a blessing to you and a challenge. I pray that you can just stop and reflect upon the implications in your life. I think it goes something like this. I'm really, really grateful this is who Jesus was. And I'm learning to be grateful that that is who he is making me to be. Love you guys. God bless, and we will see you soon.